Yang Kyoungjong's story is one of the strangest to emerge from the ashes of the Second World War. His journey is a testament to the unpredictable and often cruel twists of fate that can shape a person's life in unimaginable ways. Born in Korea in 1920, his youth was overshadowed by the Japanese occupation of his homeland. The streets he walked as a child were filled with the presence of Japanese soldiers, and the air was thick with the tension of a nation under foreign rule. Korea, annexed by Japan in 1910, ceased to exist as an independent nation. The cultural and political identity of Korea was systematically suppressed, and its people were forced to assimilate into the Japanese Empire. For many Koreans, this period was marked by a loss of identity and a struggle to maintain their heritage. For young men like Yang, the future seemed bleak under the yoke of imperial rule. Opportunities were scarce, and the oppressive regime left little room for hope or ambition. The dreams of a free and prosperous Korea seemed like a distant memory buried under the weight of occupation. Little did he know that fate had woven a most extraordinary path for him, one that would see him fight for 3 different armies in a global conflict. His journey would take him from the battlefields of Asia to the front lines of Europe, a journey that defied all logic and expectation. Imagine being a young man stripped of your nationality, living under the thumb of an oppressive regime. This was Yang's reality. He was a man without a country, a soldier without a cause, caught in the machinery of a war that spanned continents and claimed millions of lives. In 1938, at the age of 18, his life took a dramatic turn. The Japanese Empire, in its relentless quest for expansion, needed more soldiers to fuel its war machine. Yang, like many young Koreans, was forcibly conscripted into the military. He was forcibly conscripted into the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force occupying Manchuria. This was a brutal and unforgiving environment where young conscripts were thrown into the harsh realities of war with little training and even less regard for their well-being. Suddenly he was no longer just a subject of the Japanese Empire, he was a soldier in its service, destined for the battlefields of a war he never chose. The transition from civilian to soldier was abrupt and jarring, a stark reminder of the powerlessness that defined his existence under Japanese rule. The battles in Manchuria were fierce and unrelenting. Yang found himself in the midst of a conflict that was as much about survival as it was about military objectives. The harsh conditions, the constant threat of death, and the brutal reality of war left an indelible mark on him. But Yang's journey was far from over. Captured by Soviet forces during a battle, he was taken as a prisoner of war. This marked the beginning of yet another chapter in his extraordinary life, one that would see him don the uniform of a different army and fight in a different theater of war. Forced to fight for the Soviet Red Army, Yang was thrust into the brutal Eastern Front. The conditions were harsh, the battles were fierce, and the stakes were higher than ever. Yet, through it all he persevered, driven by an unyielding will to survive. Eventually Yang found himself in the hands of the Germans, captured once again and forced to fight for the Wehrmacht. His journey had come full circle, from the battlefields of Asia to the front lines of Europe, a testament to the unpredictable and often cruel twists of fate that can shape a person's life in unimaginable ways. The Kwantung Army was no ordinary force. Tasked with securing Japan's interests in Manchuria, it was a brutal and unforgiving institution. For Yang, training would have been harsh and unforgiving, designed to mold him into an obedient and expendable cog in the Japanese war machine. He was taught Japanese, drilled relentlessly, and subjected to the strict hierarchy and often brutal discipline of the Imperial Army. Life as a Korean conscript in the Japanese Army was one of hardship and discrimination. Koreans were seen as second-class citizens within the empire, and this prejudice permeated every level of military life. Yet, Yang endured. He had little choice. To defy the Japanese was to invite swift and brutal retribution. He was shipped westwards towards the escalating conflict between Japan and the Soviet Union. His destination, the vast, unforgiving battlefields of Khalkhin Gol. The battles of Khalkhin Gol, fought in the summer of 1939, were a brutal clash between the Japanese Kwantung Army and the forces of the Soviet Union and its Mongolian allies. This conflict, though often overshadowed by the larger events of World War II, was a significant precursor to the global struggle that would soon engulf the world. The battles were not just a test of military might but also a clash of ideologies, with the Japanese Empire seeking to expand its influence in Asia, while the Soviets aimed to protect their borders and assert their dominance. It was here that Yang Kyoungjong received his baptism of fire. A young Korean conscript, Yang had been forcibly drafted into the Japanese army, a fate that befell many Koreans during Japan's occupation of Korea. Thrust into the heart of a brutal and unfamiliar conflict, Yang's journey was just beginning. The fighting was fierce and unforgiving, a clash of ideologies and ambitions in the heart of the Mongolian steppe. The vast open terrain provided little cover, and the soldiers on both sides faced harsh conditions, from scorching summer heat to sudden violent storms. For Yang, caught in the maelstrom of this conflict, survival became paramount. He witnessed firsthand the ferocity of modern warfare, the likes of which he had never imagined. The deafening roar of artillery, the relentless machine gun fire, and the cries of wounded comrades created a symphony of chaos and destruction. The trenches, hastily dug into the hard ground, offered little protection from the relentless bombardment. The deafening roar of artillery was a constant reminder of the ever-present danger. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the ground, shaking the very core of the soldiers' resolve. The terror of aerial bombardment added another layer of horror to the battlefield. Bombers swooped down from the sky, dropping their deadly payloads with devastating accuracy. The soldiers below could do little but pray and hope to survive the onslaught, and the sight of men dying in the mud and dust of the battlefield. The ground, once dry and cracked, quickly turned into a quagmire of mud and blood, making movement difficult and escape nearly impossible. The cries of the wounded and dying echoed across the steppe, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. The Japanese, despite their initial aggression, were ultimately defeated by the Soviets, led by the cunning and ruthless Georgy Zhukov, a general whose strategic brilliance and unyielding determination would later achieve legendary status during the war in Europe. Zhukov's tactics at Khalkhin Gol were a precursor to the strategies he would employ against the Nazis, showcasing his ability to outmaneuver and outthink his opponents, a general who would later achieve legendary status during the war in Europe. His leadership at Khalkhin Gol not only secured a crucial victory for the Soviets but also cemented his reputation as one of the most formidable military minds of the 20th century. It was during this chaotic retreat that Yang's life took yet another unexpected turn. Captured by the Soviets, he was given a stark choice: join the Red Army or face an uncertain fate in a Soviet labor camp. Yang chose to fight, and thus began the next chapter of his incredible journey, one that would see him traverse continents and fight under multiple flags in a war that reshaped the world. Captured by the advancing Soviets, Yang's life took a dramatic turn. The once proud soldier, who had donned the Japanese uniform with a sense of duty and honor, now found himself at the mercy of a new and formidable enemy. The Soviets, relentless in their advance, showed no leniency to those they captured. Yang found himself stripped of his Japanese uniform, a symbol of his former allegiance, and thrust into a new reality. The uniform that once gave him an identity was now gone, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. He was thrust into the unfamiliar world of a prisoner of war camp, a place where hope was a scarce commodity. The camp was a stark contrast to the life he had known, filled with uncertainty and fear. He was now a captive of the very power that had vanquished his former captors. The irony was not lost on him. He had gone from being a soldier of the Japanese Empire to a prisoner of the Soviet Union, a twist of fate that seemed almost surreal. The Soviet gulags were notorious, infamous for their brutal conditions and harsh treatment of prisoners. These vast prison camps were scattered across the Siberian wilderness, isolated and desolate. Conditions were harsh, with little food, inadequate clothing, and the constant threat of disease. The Siberian winters were particularly brutal, with temperatures plummeting to unbearable lows. For many prisoners, survival was a daily struggle, and constant threat of disease. For many prisoners, the gulags became their final resting place. The combination of hard labor, insufficient nutrition, and rampant illness claimed countless lives. The gulags became their final resting place. The sight of mass graves and emaciated bodies was a grim reminder of the fate that awaited many. Yet, amidst this despair, there were those who clung to the hope of survival and escape. Yet Yang's story was far from over. Despite the overwhelming odds, he refused to succumb to despair. His spirit remained unbroken, and he began to plot his next move, determined to find a way out of this living nightmare. The Soviets, facing a growing manpower shortage, saw an opportunity in their prisoners. As the Nazi war machine rolled over the Western Soviet Union in 1941, the need for soldiers became increasingly dire. As the Nazi war machine rolled over the Western Soviet Union in 1941, the Soviets were desperate for reinforcements. The relentless advance of the Nazis had stretched their resources thin, and every able-bodied man was needed to defend the motherland. Offered their prisoners a grim choice: continue to languish in the camps, or fight for the Red Army against a common enemy. It was a choice that came with its own set of risks and uncertainties. Continue to languish in the camps, facing the daily horrors of the Gulag, or take up arms and fight for the very nation that had imprisoned them. It was a dilemma that forced many to weigh their options carefully, or fight for the Red Army against a common enemy. For Yang, desperate to escape the horrors of the Gulag, the choice was clear. He volunteered to fight, seeing it as his only chance at freedom. For Yang, desperate to escape the horrors of the Gulag, the choice was clear. He volunteered to fight, driven by a desire to survive and a glimmer of hope that this path might lead him to freedom. The decision was not made lightly, but it was one he felt he had to make, unaware that his odyssey was far from over. The journey ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty, but Yang was resolute. He marched off to an uncertain future, his fate intertwined with the tumultuous events of a world at war.